We have no leverage over the Russians in Europe at all now. They hold all the cards, and they've won this war unambiguously, and they have the force. We do not. Our army is pitiful. It's a shadow of its former self. It's not trained well. It's not ready to fight anybody in most cases. We need to get it out, bring it home, and build a new army, not rebuild it. I think that's true for a lot of the Europeans as well. The Russians are in a very strong position. So what we ought to seek is something they've mentioned, which is a new security architecture in Europe. And that would allow us to dramatically reduce our footprint over there, which is something President Trump wants, to change how we interact and to become more transparent on all sides and permanently put these hostilities behind us, because there's no reason for them. You know, Russia is not our sworn enemy. We are not Russia's sworn enemy. This is all artificial, created by a small minority of people in Washington who hijacked the government. This is a man who does not want war, but not wanting war is not enough. You have to pursue courses of action that are designed to avoid war.
The message is clear. Douglas Macgregor sees the U.S. military as a shadow of its former self, powerless in Europe, outmatched by Russia, and on the verge of strategic failure. He paints a picture of a war that was never winnable, a conflict orchestrated by a hidden elite in Washington. But here's the real question. If the U.S. has already lost, what comes next? Is the world sleepwalking into a new order where Russia dictates the rules? We've just analyzed Douglas Macgregor's perspective, highlighting the complexities surrounding the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical maneuvering by global powers. But as the battlefield evolves and diplomatic tensions escalate, a new reality is emerging, one where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky finds himself increasingly isolated. The European Union is ramping up its financial and military support, while Russia continues its offensive, making significant territorial gains. Meanwhile, former U.S. President Donald Trump is advocating for negotiations, without Zelensky at the table. This raises the stakes dramatically as Ukraine faces mounting pressure from both allies and adversaries. Let's dive deep into this unfolding situation. Over the past 12 hours, several critical developments have unfolded, each shaping the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. The most striking revelation comes from Donald Trump, who has made it clear that he sees no place for Zelensky in peace negotiations. According to Trump, Zelensky has been a poor negotiator, failing to secure a favorable outcome for Ukraine. He argues that Ukraine could have prevented the war entirely if only Zelensky and President Joe Biden had communicated differently with Russia. Trump's recent conversation with Putin was described as very good, while his talks with Ukraine were not so good, further underscoring his stance that negotiations should proceed without Zelensky. This raises profound concerns for Ukraine's leadership. If Trump returns to power, his administration could pursue a deal directly with Russia, effectively sidelining Ukraine. The U.S. is reportedly open to an agreement that would involve Ukraine, or even Russia, paying back a staggering $450 billion for access to rare earth metals. This suggests that economic interests are playing a significant role in shaping U.S. foreign policy. Trump's approach is transactional. He is willing to negotiate with either side as long as the deal benefits the United States. Meanwhile, Ukraine's domestic situation is becoming more precarious. According to recent reports, 64% of Ukrainians support direct negotiations with Russia. This suggests that war fatigue is setting in among the Ukrainian population, with many viewing talks as the only viable path to ending the conflict. However, Zelensky remains steadfast in his resistance, refusing to capitulate or enter negotiations under unfavorable terms. His reluctance to engage in talks could further isolate him, especially if Western leaders begin to shift their stance. While Trump advocates for negotiations, European nations are taking a different approach. The European Union is preparing a new €20 billion military aid package for Ukraine. This financial boost is expected to sustain Ukraine's military operations for another 4 to 5 months, possibly until a broader negotiation process begins. This move signals that the EU is not yet willing to pressure Ukraine into talks with Russia, but instead aims to strengthen its position on the battlefield. However, European leaders are also hedging their bets. Polish President Andrzej Duda recently revealed that he had a candid conversation with Zelensky, urging him to maintain constructive cooperation with Trump. This is a clear indication that Poland, a staunch supporter of Ukraine, is preparing for a potential shift in U.S. policy. Duda's advice can be interpreted as a warning. Zelensky cannot afford to alienate Trump, especially if he wins the upcoming election. Germany is also recalibrating its strategy. A leading candidate for German chancellor has proposed that Germany, alongside France and Britain, should use its nuclear weapons to protect Ukrainian territory. This suggestion underscores growing fears that the U.S. may reduce its support under a potential Trump administration. France has reportedly approached Germany multiple times to discuss nuclear guarantees for Ukraine, but Berlin has yet to respond. If European nations move forward with these discussions, it could mark a dramatic shift in the region's security dynamics. While diplomatic maneuvering continues, the situation on the ground is rapidly deteriorating for Ukraine. Russian forces have made significant progress in multiple sectors, further compounding Zelensky's challenges. In the southern front, Russian troops have captured another tree line near the settlement of Prayutna. This move aims to cut off Ukrainian supply lines, making it increasingly difficult for Kyiv's forces to maintain their positions. If this encirclement continues, Ukrainian units may be forced to retreat, further weakening their defensive posture. In the Bakhmut region, Russian forces have secured over 75% of a strategic village, with only a few contested areas remaining under Ukrainian control. Geolocation data confirms that the settlement of Andriivka is now almost entirely under Russian control. This puts additional pressure on Ukrainian forces in Kostiantynivka, a critical stronghold. Russian troops are expected to launch an encirclement operation within the next 3 days, potentially forcing a Ukrainian withdrawal. If Kostiantynivka falls, it could open the door for Russia to push further west. In the Siversk direction, Russian bombardments have intensified, targeting Ukrainian military installations in Sloviansk. Reports indicate that multiple warehouses and supply depots have been destroyed, further straining Ukraine's logistical capabilities. Additionally, Russian troops have gained control over key strongholds in Borova, making it increasingly difficult for Ukraine to hold the region. Further north, in the Kupiansk direction, Russian forces have taken full control of Topoly, a small but strategically significant settlement along the border. This development highlights Russia's intent to secure key border regions, which could serve as staging grounds for future offensives. The developments of the past 12 hours paint a grim picture for Ukraine. Zelensky is under immense pressure from multiple directions. Diplomatic isolation. Trump's push for negotiations without Zelensky threatens to weaken Ukraine's bargaining position. If the U.S. shifts its stance, Ukraine may find itself increasingly reliant on European support. European calculations. While the EU is increasing military aid, European leaders are also preparing for a potential reduction in U.S. support. Germany and France are discussing nuclear guarantees, while Poland is advising Zelensky to engage more constructively with Trump. Military struggles. On the battlefield, Russian forces are making steady gains. Ukrainian troops are facing increasing encirclement risks, logistical challenges, and mounting casualties. The war has now reached a critical juncture. With Ukraine's defenses weakening and diplomatic pressures mounting, Zelensky faces an unprecedented challenge. His refusal to negotiate may keep Ukraine in the fight, but at what cost? Meanwhile, Russia continues its offensive, steadily chipping away at Ukrainian-held territory. As the situation develops, one question remains. Can Ukraine withstand both military and diplomatic pressures, or is it being pushed toward a settlement that may not be on its terms? The situation in Ukraine continues to escalate, with multiple players pursuing their own interests in the conflict. Donald Trump's push for negotiations, without Zelensky, signals a shift in the U.S. approach, prioritizing deals over direct support. His recent statements suggest he sees Ukraine as a bargaining chip rather than a partner, reinforcing the idea that peace talks could happen without Ukrainian leadership at the table. Meanwhile, European leaders are maneuvering to protect their own geopolitical and economic stakes, with Germany and France weighing nuclear guarantees and the EU preparing a massive military aid package to sustain Ukraine's defense. At the same time, the battlefield remains brutally active. Russian forces are pressing their offensive across multiple fronts, making incremental but significant gains in strategic locations. Ukrainian defenses are holding, but at an enormous cost, with elite forces being deployed to stabilize critical positions. The battles in the south, near Bakhmut, and in the northern sector underscore the immense pressure Ukraine faces. The Russian military's methodical advances, coupled with relentless air and artillery strikes, suggest a long and grinding campaign ahead, one that Ukraine can only endure with continued Western backing. The broader picture reveals a grim reality. Ukraine is being squeezed politically and militarily. Western support remains crucial, but it is entangled in domestic politics, economic interests, and shifting alliances. While some European nations are committed to sustaining Ukraine's resistance, others are preparing for a scenario where Ukraine may have to negotiate from a weakened position. The uncertainty surrounding U.S. involvement under a possible Trump administration only adds to the precariousness of Ukraine's situation. What happens next? Will Ukraine manage to hold out and turn the tide, or will shifting international politics force it into an unfavorable settlement? The stakes have never been higher, and the coming weeks will be critical in determining the trajectory of the war. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest developments. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Should Ukraine continue fighting at all costs, or is a negotiated settlement the only way forward? Your engagement helps keep this conversation going and ensures more people are informed about these crucial global events. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next update.